Good evening, Just Your Average Fishers fans. Justin here from the Just Your Average Fishers Facebook and Instagram page. And thank you for joining us on the quick turnaround for probably what will be our largest and most controversial live Facebook show that we have ever hosted. Tonight, we are unpacking a very, very serious issue to fishing within Victoria, an issue where our regulatory body is making substantial changes, maybe under government budgetary pressure or spending pressure, to effectively remove a substantial part of all of our science and our fisheries officers and redeploying some of those assets into different areas of the business, so to speak, that will definitely have a degradation across our state in our fishing stocks, you name it, it's going to hurt. Now, whilst that sounds like a bit of an editorial from me, we've assembled a panel tonight that will unpack these issues so you, a recreational fisher or a pro fisher, can make your own determination, but will evidence it very, very well at just how the Victorian Fisheries Authority has probably lost its way from a regulatory body to now a body that is about maybe being Facebook friends with recreational fishers and, an education party, which, yes, it needs to do, but really, is it about compliance and policing and making sure we preserve our fishery? Or is it about hosting live bands and getting people some cake and some sausages down at the Portland Festival? I'm not so sure. Tonight, I'd like to introduce our panel of some of the most experienced fishers, policyholders and people that have lived and worked within fishing or policy, policing, within fisheries themselves, to help us unpack these issues and talk about them in a professional and proper manner. Can I just do a bit of housekeeping and please ask that all of your comments and questions on the live feed tonight are done so in a professional and kind manner. We're all here to support each other and we don't want to necessarily point the gun. We can point the gun at the issues, but not at any individual and certainly not at anyone that shares a contrary opinion. Second of all, if I could ask for another housekeeping issue, we need to make sure that this message and this show gets out as far and as wide as we can. Please share this live feed on your respective Facebook pages, particularly all of the wonderful businesses in the fishing industry, the charter operators, the tackle stores, and the relative clubs and bodies that have shared my notices over the last few days advertising this show. If you can share that live now to make this go wide and as far across our recreational fishing community as you can, I'd really appreciate it. Without further ado, though, I'd like to introduce our panel and let's get straight into the issue. Tonight, I welcome, first of all, Ben Scullin, Chief Executive of VRFish, Victoria's peak fishing recreational body. Ben, how are you this evening?
I'm well, Justin. Thanks for having me.
Ben, you've been involved in fishing advocacy, the boating and tackle industry for well over 20, 25 years. Could you please just give me a little bit of a backdrop to how you've come to be in VRFish and why this issue is so important to you?
Oh, geez, talking about a long story there, Justin. So a long time ago, I saw an ad that was headlined, "Do you love fishing?" And it was an ad for the peak body for recreational fishing. And I thought, yes, I do love fishing. So way back in the early 2000s, I joined VRFish as a bright-eyed project officer and cut my teeth on an advocacy issue. The first advocacy issue was a fence that was built across public land in Werribee. And then, bigger issues like the Mako ban and a few other things. I then went on to the Boating Industry Association and advocated for boating and industry, and back to VRFish after a stint in China working for a manufacturer. And I've been this time with VRFish for 4.5 years as the EO. So I have like a business management, a governance and an advocacy role with VRFish. So the peak body, an independent peak body providing a voice for recreational fishing and that sort of, make fishing better type vision. We're independent of government. We're funded out of a notional percentage of recreational fishing licence fees. So in the advocacy space, we have 6 strategic pillars, if you will, of advocacy: access, water, habitat, promotion of rec fishing, best practice, and supporting our members. And ultimately, the way VRFish works in advocacy, especially in any advocacy of an issue is the ability to provide advice to a decision maker in a very timely way and in a way that's giving high confidence to your advice. So on this issue, it's a very interesting process, if you will, that VRFish goes about it, because our job is to be able to provide the government with a package of advice that includes, the opinion of the old bloke on Mordialloc Pier catching gars through to organised wreck fishing, through to a considered opinion of the VRFish board. And we have reference groups, which are groups of experts feeding us advice, board committees, and a board of 9 volunteers, that when they consider an issue from the state perspective of wreck fishing and fisheries management, it's a pretty impressive skill set. So we got a phone call, a heads up in late Feb. There's a reform process underway. We kind of knew something was going to be happening, but we didn't know what it was. And then we were told what the reform proposal was. So the board, I'm forever feeding up advocacy briefings and the board spent the weekend considering it and talking, and then we had an emergency board meeting. And ultimately, in the end, we asked VFA leadership for a briefing further, and that all culminated then in formal advice to the minister in a letter where we made recommendations. And ultimately, what we said was, it looks to us as if the risk is too high that this reform process will result in damage to recreational fishing. Mm-hmm. And there was a few reasons and a few recommendations that we made. So ultimately, the ability to then say to the minister, you've heard the reaction of wreck fishers, 20,000 signatures on a petition with, the majority wreck fishers is a pretty loud voice. But we then committed to the minister that we'll go and survey wreck fishers and we'll provide a considered opinion for you across a whole range of areas that might help deliver a better outcome. Secretly hoping that we'd help the minister push back on Treasury and, so ultimately the issue for us, and it's a good thing to visualise it as well. So if you think about the current status with staffing at fisheries stations across the state, and there are a number of gaps or vacancies, as they're called, and I've got a table there that we might be able to bring up that'll help. Some stations are operating at 50% staffing levels, and we're really interested in the Port Phillip region stations, if you like. But ultimately, the proposal, is to go from 27 fisheries officers in the Port Phillip region to 9. Oh. And, when you take into account a number of things on risk, which risk is just, likelihood of an outcome, ultimately the opinion of the board of VRFish on behalf of wreck fishers is that this decision, if it goes ahead, this reform process, and noting it's not just, there's 35 staff involved in this reform process. So we've got key science staff and managers, and if this was to occur, our advice to the minister is that this will have detrimental outcomes in a number of areas, and our recommendation is don't do it.
Yeah,
find a better way.
I completely agree with you, and I think that's very well spoken. We need to unpack this further. So what I might do is I'm going to introduce the rest of our panel. Sure. I'm going to come back and then quick fire some important questions to get us underway for unpacking this. So I appreciate that. So to our next panellist, who I announced the other night, I'm so proud to have him joining the show, Mr. Murray Donaldson, who is a retired 37-year veteran in Victorian Fisheries Authority. his retirement gig was Chief Fishing Investigator or Chief Compliance Investigator. He's not only served a very long period of time within the years of where poaching was rife and coordinating resources further and farther from Victoria's Fisheries Authorities through to Victoria Police to break down the lack of compliance and to break down the crime rate in fishing. He also served as a committee member on the Victorian, now tell me if I got this right, Murray, the Australian National Fisheries Compliance Committee, of which you were there for 15 years and chaired for 7. And just to show just the government actually recognised your importance of your service by providing you a Australia Day honour of a service medal for your work in fisheries compliance in 1995. So I think that everyone will agree that you come to our show tonight with first-hand understanding of the importance of compliance, the detriment that lack of compliance can have to our fishery. And I think that that's what people don't understand. That, am I right in saying that, Murray, there would be people that will go, screw the fisheries officers, means I don't get a chance of getting checked. But I tell you, you're going to pipe up pretty loudly in a few years when compliance is non-existent and so is fish on the end of your line. Welcome to the show, Murray.
Thanks very much, Justin. Look, I guess that I'm taking this proposal quite personally. I'm agitated, frustrated and disrespected. We did some very difficult and dangerous work over a long period of time, and John will back me up on this because we worked hand in glove with some of the specialist units in Vicpol. This is going to tear down a legacy that myself and a lot of other dedicated officers put in place, a reasonable compliance regime, which now seems to be being torn down. I'm disappointed in the VFA board that they, first of all, they don't have a fisheries compliance person on the board, which is astounding, considering that the majority of staff and budget is in that portfolio. But they never reached out to anyone with fisheries compliance experience to test what would be the outcome if this proposal goes through. So I guess that I can come back to some of the detail later on, but it took us 10 years of having great support from the fisheries officers, and you've got to understand the role that they play in underpinning investigations and operations. They, in their day-to-day activities, are picking up information, submitting that into the intelligence office. That forms intelligence that we can use and analyse and then target specific groups and share that information right across the state. So regardless of where these mobile fisheries criminals go, everyone's got the same set of information. So absolutely critical that they remain in place. I don't think it's come out in discussions specifically, but they've been carrying 16 vacancies for up to 2 years already. They've had their cut. Why take more? Seriously. Anyway, look, with those opening remarks, I'm happy to contribute to some of the questions that might come my way later on.
We've got plenty, and some of them are going to be pretty scathing. So with some of the evidence that we have to share, and again, this isn't necessarily about advocating against Victorian Fisheries Authority, VFA. This is about advocating for if they need to make budgetary change, to do it in a considered manner to where we protect what's most vital versus, unfortunately, need to cut things that are really cool and also important, but perhaps not as important as protecting our fishery. So with that, talking about compliance, I'd like to welcome a personal friend of mine who has spent his career in policing in some of the most tactical environments of Victoria Police. He's not only a rec fisho, but a well-known pro fisho, sponsored angler, spent many years in the tackle industry himself, bipartisan. John Cahill, welcome to the show, and thanks for joining us again from Just Your Average Fisho's live Facebook show V2.
Thank you very much, Justin, and thanks to all the other panel members, I guess, tonight for making themselves available, I think we're in for a good chat here.
I agree.
I think it's we're going to unpack things quite a bit. I'd off the offset like to first of all offer a little bit of an apology to the other VFA staff members that are effectively in the gun over this proposal. And I apologise because I've got nothing in my arsenal to help them. I don't know enough about science. I don't know enough about their other roles that are in the gun. But if we want to talk about enforcement, about the role of a fisheries officer, I come from an enforcement background. 33 years in Victoria Police. 12 of those years were at the Special Operations Group. 6 years were the officer in charge of the Technical Surveillance Unit, which is where Murray and myself have almost crossed paths, apart from being a very slightly different generation. And a poignant part of my career, 2 years as an inspector in the Human Resources Department, although they were a dark time for me, not what I was cut out for. I actually did learn some pretty valuable stuff about staff allocation that we'll probably talk about later. Before throwing back, Justin, I just want to say this proposal that we're going to discuss, where did the VFA get this operating model from? Like, has this been put into practice or trialled anywhere in the world, or is this local policy dreamt up by the VFA that's going to be run out and because it feels like a good idea? It's way too risky to simply give a go to. The cost could be effectively a collapse of fisheries. So, which we've seen in South Australia takes years to undo. But that'll do me for now.
Fantastic. I really appreciate that, John. But I think that the compliance piece is so important, and I'm sure that Murray and yourself can dovetail off that as we circle back around. Because the compliance piece, I don't think people understand what it really means, and more importantly, that if we allow a free-for-all, and I know that sounds a little bit speculative about what could happen, but I think that you need to acknowledge that where no officers and little compliance exists, you can only do so much. And it doesn't take much to put a dent in a fish stock that then takes decades to recover without it being affected. So we can talk about that as we circle back around. I will just now circle back to Ben, because let's kick this off. And I mean, let's kick it off real time, real chat, Ben. Let me play a little scenario too. So VFA regulates fishing in our state, from everything from understanding the science to setting bag limits to policing those bag limits at a professional and a recreational level. They're seen, they're around, they educate, they advocate for rec fishers and pro fishers, and they're not immune to whatever the budget state of the government of the time is in Victoria. So they're not immune to the fact that, let's just call it for what it is, Victoria is in substantive debt. It's generational debt. We're not going to talk about how we got there or why it happened and what political party it is responsible for, because I think that that's just an emotive issue that doesn't provide any kudos or credit to the issue that we're discussing tonight. But they need to make changes. And if I replay to you that my understanding is that they've been come and asked to make changes, they've been asked to fit some cuts. And from my understanding is that the executive at VFA, rather than take a pragmatic view to what's important most, has put forward a proposal of where fundamentally savings are coming out of, they'll cut some events, they'll cut some advocacy, but the primary cuts are going to come from the dismissal or redundancy of the primary fisheries officers that are in play at the moment, which is actually not the number that should be in play in the moment, as Murray indicated. And what that means is that when you reduce that stock of fisheries officers that are live, visible, and advocating for correct compliance and protecting our fisheries, any reduction does the opposite. You're not advocating for it. You're saying that it's fine, and you're assuming that everything's going to be okay. So that concerns me. The other piece is that they're telling us that everything's okay, which quite frankly is just political BS and spin. And so have I got this right? or do you think that there's much more to that? Tell me if I'm wrong.
Well, look, in a nutshell, it's such a large area to consider. Ultimately, it's a budget-driven, budget savings-driven response. It's almost a business reform. That any CEO is going to tell you that when you're looking at a quantum of budget savings that VFA are, it's $9.4 million a year ongoing. It doesn't seem, well, I mean, it is a lot, but it's not that much compared to other departmental budgets. But ultimately, that comes from staff. And the key numbers are that there's 192 staff in Victorian Fisheries Authority, and 35 of those staff are now caught in the reform proposal. 27 of those 35 are fisheries officers. Now, the proposal is to reduce the number of fisheries officers in the Port Phillip region from 27 to 9 officers and authorised officers, but that will undertake other duties for more of the time, such as engagement. In fact, they're going to be called engagement officers, I think. So ultimately, the place to start, Justin, is with a regulatory authority that undertakes fisheries management. There is an Act of Parliament called the Fisheries Act 1995, and that is the law that governs fisheries management in the state of Victoria. And the Fisheries Act has a number of very important objectives that it's not just about managing the fisheries. So if you were to go and look up the Fisheries Act 1995, it will have a number of objectives that ultimately the first two objectives, let's say, I'm not going to read them verbatim, but one is about the management and how fisheries are to be managed and developed, and that's basically in an ecologically sustainable manner. So that's got ramifications for this discussion. Then another objective of the Act, and this is something that's been overlooked a little, is that the objective of the Fisheries Act 1995 is to protect and conserve fisheries resources, habitats, and, things like aquatic ecological processes. So this is the link, not just to the management side with enforcement and compliance, but the protect and conserve objective of the Act. And ultimately, then everything flows out from that in this discussion. So the law says the Victorian Fisheries Authority have to do certain things. Okay. So when you look at what VRFish are saying to the minister, and we went to the CEO of VFA, Travis Dowling, and Travis just said, look, we've pushed back on this as hard as we can. This is it. This is the proposal. So ultimately we go, well, there's only one other way, and that is the minister has to hear, all of the sectors involved hear them loudly, and the minister has to then go and advocate for a better outcome. Yep. And ultimately then, if you looked at the number of vacancies in the region with the proposal to have 9 in the central region, then 9 officers, then you looked at how big the central region actually is, and then you have a look at how many staff are in the stations surrounding the region, because if you have 3 staff in 3 stations around the Port Phillip region, you've got to take into account, normal things like leave, and it's okay to bring in, the Yarram station's obviously going to be doing some heavy lifting with the number of staff there. But the Port Phillip region, it's not the shoreline of Port Phillip Bay. It's a massive area that goes 3 nautical miles offshore, all the way out around, from Queenscliff to the back of Geelong, the top of the Yarra, out to Gippsland, down to Phillip Island. So to remove that much enforcement and compliance is a really big risk. And the considered opinion of the board of VRFish is that that will be detrimental to the objectives of the Fisheries Act. I mean, that's what we're getting at. So ultimately then you have to say, well, how do we prove that? You know, it shouldn't be our job. And both Murray and John have alluded to it, where they say, well, risk assessment was done. Well, I haven't seen it. It appears to be a purely budgetary driven process. When you think about the Fisheries Act and the law that guides fisheries management, there's a whole range of items underneath that, subordinate legislation and you know, the national compliance strategy that Victoria signed up to, that talks about optimum compliance, the word optimum. And ultimately you'll see in early letters when writing to the minister, you'll see the word efficient pop up. If you go back and read those letters, you'll see the word efficient is in there. That's budgetary.
Yeah.
That's not optimum compliance. And so when we're working towards optimum compliance in a fisheries management regime, it's a scale of things that, engagement and education are important. Voluntary compliance is, you know, the goal. That's what the national strategy says. So ultimately then you've got to manage fisheries under, you know, ecological sustainable management principles, and they're really clear on what sort of compliance and enforcement regime you need there. So you know, you've not only got to have the means of enforcing critical aspects of management arrangements, but you have to be capable of assessing, monitoring, avoiding, remedying, mitigating any adverse impacts. And the current staffing level that's proposed for statewide, noting the gaps, noting the size of the area, noting that it'll be 3 stations, we're saying to the minister that's not going to be enough, because a whole range of outcomes are now possible from, you know, the risk that if we take the 90% compliance comment on board, that declines, the risk is low. If it got to 50%, we'd be in trouble. If you know, generalist direct fishing population went to 50% compliance, the resource and the environment would be in trouble. But the risk of that happening within the next 5 years, you know, is low. Could happen, but it's
I'd have to disagree with you there, Ben. My experience back in the late 90s, early 2000s, when we were right up against it, and keep in mind at that time I had a staff of 15. That was in the investigations area, supported by nearly 80 fisheries officers, and we were up against it. So this thing, if this proposal goes ahead and those cuts occur, I think you'll start to see impacts within 12 months. You know, the first areas that are going to be vulnerable are marine parks. They've been locked up for 25 years now. They are pristine reference areas that are used by fish for spawning and provide reference areas for scientists. They are going to be smashed. I mean, without active and regular compliance, why would you buy a licence? There's no risk perception that I'm going to get checked. So, okay, then you go to the next one. Would you bother stopping at 20 King George whiting if you're not going to get checked? And then size limits. And then the gear limits, closed seasons. Well, why bother? If I'm not going to get checked, I'll go fishing for Murray cod in the closed season. I'll give myself the best chance of catching a Murray cod. And then there's the abalone and rock lobster seasons as well. Yeah, I mean, it all just starts to unravel. And the only tangible thing that the VFA will see will be the initial drop in the take-up of recreational licences. All the other things will be happening, but the only thing they will see tangibly is a reduction in the take-up of a recreational licence.
That's very interesting, Murray. And Ben, you're absolutely right, in my opinion. But Ben, I just want to refer back to the policy. So VFA has a requirement under the Fisheries Act to ensure that it's doing its protection. So one, it's probably not able to meet its obligations under this proposal to the Act, if I'm summarising that. But also, second of all, talking about proposal and Travis Dowling saying this is the only option, government would have gone to VFA and said, we need these budget cuts, come up with a proposal. They wouldn't have said, this is the proposal. They would have gone to those leaders and said,
for sure.
Tell us a proposal. Here's the timeline we need it. This is the dollars we need you to reduce. And if you can tell me straight down the camera tonight that VFA don't spend $10 million in other engagement activities, buying fishing rods for kids, which is all very important. I advocate for this. I advocate for VFA, or at least $5 million could come from that, or $3 million could come from that before you're attacking fisheries officers. And I know salaries and rent are always your biggest cost sometimes, in business. So I understand this well. But quite frankly, if you've got an obligation to protect, we've already got take up of fishing like no tomorrow. Actually, Australia is one of the only countries in the world where fishing take up and fishing tackle sales is on the increase despite economic issues and cost of living expenses around the world. So tackle companies are dumping horrendous amounts with their big, internationally owned wholesalers and so forth. I know this. I live and breathe this outside of my profession. So for Travis Dowling to say that, I would challenge that as absolute crap. And again, I'm impassionate, I'm emotive, I come to you as an experienced person. Do you agree with that? Like what would be the other budget? So what would be the budget of events in hiring bands and engagement activities that they could slice significantly?
Look, I think ultimately you've got to untangle some of the funding that we pay for, that we contribute to. So recreational fishing licence fees, way back with the introduction of the All Waters licence, there was a deal that those fees, similar to the Better Boating Fund for marine licence and registration fees, the All Waters licence fees would go into a trust fund. The Fisheries Act also makes it very clear that's to be used to benefit recreational fishing. So there's $2 million a year from the RFL funds enforcement and compliance. It funds a whole range of other things like grants to clubs. So ultimately, the first point I'd make is that, I'm not the CEO of VFA. So you can only take the advice on face value that's where the reform process is being proposed. We took a different view and said, look, we think that the quantum of funding is such and the risk of damage is so high, and I'll quickly throw in, Murray, that rec fishing's changed a lot in the last 20 years. And, it started with best practice seafood handling, care for your catch, through to things like care for cod and the national rec fishing survey showing that 75% of rec fishers now pick up someone else's litter and stuff. Rec fishing stewardship has changed, and that's going to act as a brake. I'm not saying that non-compliance won't grow in the generalist fishing population under this proposal if it goes south, but ultimately it'll be slower than you think. And what our advice is, and VRFish doesn't know anything about anything other than rec fishing and fisheries management. Like, that is our expertise, done it for 30 years, and we provide that advice. And ultimately we're saying not only is the high risk of damage end of illegal fishing, so the shammaters, which are part of that generalist fishing population who will go and sell bluefin tuna and will go and sell, other important key species, and then the syndicate fishers who, I think in our reference to the minister, we referenced the guys being caught in the car on a listening device talking about how many hundreds of kilograms they picked up on the last trip. And ultimately then the compliance in fishing in the generalist side, the 90%, this is what their VFA are alluding to when they say there's 90% compliance. It's not. There's different compliance rates for different fisheries and all sorts of stuff. But what they're saying is that fishing is different. There's a high enough level of stewardship that voluntary compliance will be high enough, and they take that into account in the science of fisheries management as well as the decision making for regulatory outcomes. But ultimately, it's not only going to see the damage, the quick damage end, but it's going to see it incentivised. And I'm not an expert in white collar crime, but I'm looking at a couple of blokes who are. So economic crime, and in depressed economic, times, the ability to make a buck from something, a lot of these syndicate fishers, it's only fish. It's not, you're not robbing a bank, but the damage that's going to occur, because if you look at where these, criminal activities are occurring, and I'm not saying that the intertidal zone at Ricketts Point Marine Park's not about to be picked bare. We've got concerns that wreck fishers, there were 70 fines in Ricketts Point Marine Park in an operation. And I think that's what the VFA leadership are also relying on, is the ability to pull in staff from regional areas for operations very quickly. And even at the current staffing levels, it took 3 days to get onto, a lot of wrecked fishers fishing in a marine park. I mean, this is the free for all that Murray's referring to, and God forbid that occurs as well.
Yeah.
The resourcing to take on the very quickly damaging end to not just wreck fishing, but industry. So you've got the commercial industry as well as the tackle industry.
Yeah.
You've got the environment. So, has a risk assessment been done? And to go back to your question, Justin, it doesn't appear it, because this is about efficiency and budgetary savings. So that's what we've put to the minister and said, hey, we're not experts in what's about to happen, but we're telling you it's going to happen. And then I'm now on a panel with 2 experts, and I'm more than happy to hear how it's going to happen.
Well, let's John, you just wanted to chime in there for a second, just in response to some points that Ben made there.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak a little bit about that. I think it's a little bit of a rose-coloured glasses view that wreck fishers won't respond to this. I do acknowledge that stewardship has changed somewhat over the years. It's only in some quarters. It's not widespread. Fishers are just representative of society. From the top silk QCs down to, the battler, they all go fishing. It's just that strong representation of who the community is who we see out on the water. And across that broad spectrum, we've seen crime in Victoria, general crime, significantly rise for several years in a row now. In fact, one of our deputy commissioners in Vicpol, Bob Hill, was in the media in the last week or so talking about one of the reasons for the spike in crime in Victoria was the cost of living crisis. So I just don't imagine for a moment why fishing would be any different than that. From your mum and dads that just want to push it a bit further and take a few more and get some value out of their tank of fuel on their fishing day and their purchased bait, through to those syndicates, but right through to organised crime, which are really good, really, really good historically at finding vulnerabilities in regulation and enforcement and absolutely exploiting them. Has anyone noticed how much fish costs at the moment in a fishmonger? We're seeing staple species like King George whiting sometimes get up to knocking on the door of $100 a kilogram. Now, how attractive is that?
Well, my daughter bought a kilo of flathead a week ago, $70.
Yep. Yeah, look, you're absolutely right. And I think that it doesn't take much for a few people to start filling bins and illegally selling. And I think that, John, we were talking before the show that the Crimes Act increased penalties to fisheries law breaking substantially as organised crime outlaw motorcycle gangs went big time into what was effectively low punishment crimes around fish take and fish poaching, particularly abalone. We saw some deaths of poachers that got themselves into trouble in scuba diving gear and so forth off Ricketts Point and Half Moon Bay a number of years ago. So why would those crimes be and their punishments be increased substantially if it wasn't a problem?
The only reason that penalties get increased is to try and provide that greater deterrent. There's no other reason.
Yeah. But that's because it's happening, right?
Reason. That's because it's happening. Yep. Absolutely.
Yep. And just to go back to just as we pulled away from Ben just before. Look,
sorry, Ben.
I'm not a fisheries leader. I'm a general manager of a major white collar industry business. It's up to Travis to lead. This is his moment where he gets to lead and make sure that he is delivering the requirements of VFA towards that Fishing Act. And it's up to him to demonstrate with evidence, might I say, that I think that there would be some people that would have uproar if he said we're removing all engagement activities and some of those centres that we spent money on are getting culled. But what we're going to do is make sure that we protect our fishery at all costs, which is through the education of fishing management. We're going to do less stocking, and we're going to make sure that we have the officers to protect our fishery. And I don't think there might be a few disjointed wreck fishers out there that have had a few run-ins before because they've tested the bag limit or they've tested the size before and they've copped a warning or they've copped a fine, and appropriately so. I tell you, I, as an advocate who would love to consistently catch bags, because I'm just an average fisher, I would support the hiring of 200 fisheries officers. I know that's not going to happen, but I would see every little kid that got a rod not get a rod for the next 24 months, 36 months, 60 months, to make sure that our fishery is protected. Because if it becomes unprotected and it becomes then to a point where often when it becomes a problem, it's a major, major problem and it's too late. So, Murray, you've had experience in this where it was a major problem and it takes generational change, but it takes decades to get it back on track. And if you look at the likes of where potentially overfishing has affected durfish in Perth and demersal species in Perth, you look at the snapper fishery that came off very, very quickly in South Australia, they're 5-year bans. So how do you go to 1 million fishers and the average fisher, of which we have 11,000 followers on our page, snapper season is closed for the next 3 years and then we might extend it by one. There's no, you can have all the uproar you like. Stiff crap, that's what happens, no whiting fishing.
If those bans are put in place, you've got to have the compliance presence to raise the risk perception so people won't fish during that close season, if that was the outcome. Let's hope it's not. But I just want to shine a light on some of the spin that's coming out of VFA. And there was a statement made by the CEO about the removal of 700 tonnes of commercial netting out of Western Port Phillip Bay, which decreased the need for fisheries officers to make sure that they were compliant. Well, 300 tonnes of that 700 tonnes was a single licence, a guy that was taking pilchards by purse seine. And that leaves behind, in the commercial sector, in Port Phillip Bay and Western Port Bay, a 218-tonne abalone sector with 30 licences, a 60-tonne scallop dive fishery with 5 operators, and a 21-tonne eastern zone rock lobster fishery out of Western Port Bay, 36 licences. So it's one thing to say we're giving you back 700 tonnes of fish, snapper, whiting, bream, flathead, when 300 tonnes of that 700 is actually pilchards, and you've still got all these other operators that need to be checked, and they're in high-value fisheries that are monitored by quotas and real-time reporting and boat monitoring and all this sort of thing. So fisheries officers are still required for that work. And I'll just throw in a little bit of data here, which I found astonishing. The longline snapper fishery, which still exists in the bay, they fish to a quota. In 22-23, they only took 53.6 tonne of that quota, which is 61%. And in the year 23-24, they only took 29.1 tonne, which is only 33% of their quota. So that's, I don't know what to make of that. I'm not a scientist, but it would indicate to me that commercially, by that method of fishing, they're not able to catch their quota.
Sure. Now, Murray, you had some stats, and Ben, we might bring this up around the number of fisheries officers that, now, when you had your investigation team, I think I heard a comment that you had about 80 officers originally. What year was that going back to?
That would have to be around the time that marine parks were introduced. That's when there were, there's a little bit of history to this, and not a lot of people would know that the abalone sector, the commercial abalone sector, when marine parks were introduced, came after the government for compensation. In lieu of compensation, the government said, well, we'll ramp up abalone compliance across the state. So we'll give you another 23 officers. And that was the case at that time. So I would say that would be the peak. And then I would say maybe 2005, we started to see slippage with numbers of fisheries officers. And the real concern is that if this proposal was to go ahead, and then in 5 years' time, when we've got a calamity, we've got to go out and recruit. These officers go through a 10-week training academy. So you have to initially select them and then put them through the academy, place them with experienced officers to help them along and guide them and mentor them. Well, there won't be any of them in the workforce.
Well, the proposal says that, they'll have a crack team of 7 and 7 or 9 or whatever it is, and good luck to them, because that sounds like it's pretty poor. And my understanding is that crack team already exists for major investigations. So we might just bring that slide up. Do you just want to talk us through that slide? Because we've actually got an underrepresentation of fisheries officers that should be in place at the moment because we haven't been able to recruit and replace.
That's right. Yeah, look, the slide I'm looking at here, it's a per capita comparison between fisheries officers in this state and other states as compared to overall licence holders, boat licences, and so forth. So we're severely underdone in this jurisdiction. Currently, also when fully staffed, this slide I have says that we should have 69 officers compared to 106 in New South Wales, 125 in Queensland, 109 in WA, and 40 in South Australia. Keep in mind that the population in South Australia is quite low. So, the ratio of fisheries officer to population, we're sadly underdone.
Yep. Okay. Not a worry. So, tell us about, it doesn't take long for a fish species to become vulnerable and at risk due to overfishing and or poaching. You were up against it in the heydays of some of the most serious poaching crimes. You brought many of those undone. How quickly do they develop, and how quickly does it impact fish stock in your experience? Well,
you've got to understand the nature of reproduction of abalone to sort of get your head around it. Abalone, the spatfall is local on a reef. It takes them 5 to 7 years to get to mature age to reproduce. So if you're fishing down the mature stock and then below, it doesn't take long for that reef to just die, just simply die. And then invasive species come in and take over all the hollows and cracks and ledges and those sorts of things. So it happens very quickly. And from my experience, it took us a decade to get on top of abalone theft, and that was with the assistance of surveillance devices, controlled operations using undercovers, and having the benefit of indictable offence provisions with for the trafficking of for priority species. So it's with all that armoury, we were able to turn it around. But it took 10 years, absolutely, and that was with the staff at 16 in the investigations area. But again, you have to understand the role of the fisheries officers in terminating major operations. We bring them in, and you might have to simultaneously raid 8-10 premises. So they're the warrant holders. They go through the door, they arrest the offender, interview, seize evidence, and then, of course, ultimately have to give evidence themselves in court. So without them, highly trained, regularly and actively involved in that sort of stuff, you're never going to be able to call on them to help you terminate a major operation.
And I think, Murray, it would be fair to say, and we've actually got a couple of comments that I'm just referring to in our chat, that if you've got a crack team of 7 or 9, 10, whatever it is, you've got annual leave, you've got sick leave, you've got parental leave, you've got mental health stress leave. That's a very big part of corporatised organisations and government organisations today. So your effectiveness at any given point, probably throughout the year, you've got a very limited time where you've got full book of that crack team being able to operate and persecute appropriately. So, and in your day of working as a chief investigator, you had to draw on resources significantly out of Victoria Police, where that's where you met John and coordinated together, because you utilise those services and they can provide a level of tactical support. Like that must take an exceptional amount of time and effort to coordinate, so that you can, when you hit the go button on banging down doors and arresting people, that you've got a high chance of successfully prosecuting as well.
That's right. And when you build an investigation, you have to make sure that you don't go in sort of half-baked. We were quick to find out that we didn't have the skills, knowledge and expertise that some of those areas in Vicpol, which John has worked in, and so we had to tap them on the shoulder and ask them to take up roles with installation of surveillance devices, acting as undercover operatives on our behalf. So we did all the administration, got all the warrants and all those sorts of things, but the actual deployment of those advanced technologies and methodologies was often left to Victoria Police.
Yep, understand. So we might bring in John at this point. John, obviously you've met Murray as his days back as a chief investigator. You've provided tactical support with your connection into Victoria Police. What about the stats of 90% compliance? I feel that's a bit paper thin. What does active compliance mean?
Well picked up on. Before we go down that rabbit hole, I just do want to say one thing about the proposal goes ahead, and we get these cuts and fishing gets out of control, and the evidence will be not by the crime rate, and I'll explain why, that the evidence will actually be by declining fisheries. What's the VFA's ramp up to combat that? Because the reality is they won't have internal resources to do jack about it. Vicpol will not help them. Vicpol's struggling very much to do what it's meant to do in its own wheelhouse. So it'll be, IRC bids, business cases to get government money to re-establish some fisheries positions. There's 12 to 18 months before, that gets up and you get a handful of positions back. I say, and I can back this up, so another of my tenures as an inspector was I ran recruit training for 5 years. It was my second last tenure before leaving the job. I've dealt with a lot of training of newbies and seeing their development through their probationary period. It's somewhere between 2 and 5 years before, and that's with good guidance, before a new officer is reliable with minimal supervision. And I imagine fisheries wouldn't be that different, Murray.
Exactly right. Yes.
Yeah.
So your capacity to ramp things back up if, hey, we got it a bit wrong with this proposal, is severely compromised. So onto compliance. The VFA has been talking about 90% compliance and trolling through their enforcement outcomes for 22, 23, and the small amount of data that's available for 23, 24. You can see that behind the scenes there is varied compliance levels with marine parks, intertidal zones, etc., that aren't 90%. But we'll take it for a given for this discussion that overall we're talking about 90% compliance, although I'm not trusting of that. But it's extremely misleading for one simple reason. So fisheries crime is one of the crimes that's considered victimless. There's no one that owns the fish. The state effectively owns the fish. We all own the fish. So if an arrest occurs for a fisheries-related crime, the victim of that crime is statute or the state. It's similar in the normal crime sense of things like, say, a drug offence or prostitution, illegal gambling, things like that, where there's not someone saying, hey, you took my property, I'm the victim of crime. Like in a theft scenario where there's that true connection between a victim and an offender. Here we've actually really just got an offender because the victim is statute. So here's where we get into a situation where reporting becomes very much a problem. So you get a call to, say, to 13Fish of a community member's report of, say, fish theft or poaching. And fisheries officers attend that either post haste or perhaps a bit later because the travesty of time, etc., and distance to respond to that, and they find the potential wrongdoer gone or actually not offending or nothing detected. There's no report of crime. There's no report taken for a scenario where an offender is not arrested. There must be an arrest for a stat to be accrued against an offence against statute. There's no unsolved is what I'm getting at. I hope I'm explaining that well. Whereas in general crime, we'll have the victim of a crime and we may or may not have an offender. So you'll have an unsolved crime rate and a clean-up rate. It shows the full extent of crime when we have a victim. In this scenario, where we have statute is the victim of our crimes, we're only able to show our own effort to detect it. That's all we're doing. So at the current scenario where we're apparently showing 90% compliance, I'll show you another way you can get 90% compliance in the years to come under this model. And that's just keep doing what you're doing because you've got less officers to throw at patrols, less arrests occurring. Guess what? You've still got 90% or maybe even better. The real evidence, the real proof will be in declining fisheries. Yep. You can't show it by these statistics. They're completely flawed.
I agree. 90% of 10 checks is 9 checks that were good. We need it to be 90% of 40,000 checks. And John, I think we've had a little problem with your camera. We'll get you just to turn it on and off again to reset it. What's 90%? 90% is a spin, and I think that the action against the 13Fish and what has actually come out of this discussion and what we've seen over this potential policy change is that a lot of recreational fishers want to do the right thing and want to call 13Fish. And I think that a lot of people used to not want to, and now they're doing it to show that they are witnessing and seeing activity. So if they're not responding to a lot of those inquiries previously, then and they can't necessarily witness it, as you say, to the travesty of time and distance and so forth, then what are they ultimately detecting? Potentially nothing. And Ben, I think you wanted to chime in there for a second.
Sure. I think ultimately the advice from VRFish to the minister, is that voluntary compliance is a big part, but deterrence is a bigger part in the compliance picture, and that if current penalties are insufficient, and we put an example in our letter to the minister that a bloke convicted of one of the significant stick ends of was charged and convicted, found guilty of trafficking, which is a very serious fisheries offence, and ultimately was caught on a surveillance device in a car discussing what they got last time and what they sold it for, and was given a $6,000 fine without conviction. That's not a deterrent, and therefore, where's your other deterrent? And ultimately, if you looked at, and this is the crux of the issue for VRFish, can you bring up that map number 4? Map number 4 is, map number 3. Yeah, so if you look at that, the blue dots are where fisheries officers were checking for compliance. The blue across the state of Victoria, and this is 2022, so it's a little bit old, but ultimately the red is where non-compliance was found, and the blue was where compliance checks were taken. And you can see that down the bottom centre there, that's the Port Phillip region. That's ultimately, if we're talking about the stats, Murray, you just put up per capita coverage of wrecked fishes by Victorian Fisheries Officers is, 3 times lower than New South Wales, 2.5 times lower. And ultimately then what you've also got to realise is that the Port Phillip region, with 9 engagement officers at 3 stations, regardless of if they're provided ops support from other regional areas, Ernst & Young's 2020 economic valuation of wrecked fishing in Victoria estimated that more than half of wrecked fishers in Victoria, of the 1.14 million, cite Port Phillip region as their primary destination. So if you're then looking at how 9 enforcement authorised officers can possibly, provide the deterrent end for even the generalist wreck fishing population, which is now 50,000 wreck fishers for every, or more than 55,000 wreck fishers for one fisheries officer. Like, it is insane. Can't do it. But ultimately, we're going to call, we just call on it and say, well, why is it up to us to have to show you this? Minister, you come out, put your hand on your heart and tell us that it's not going to result in what we're saying. That's going to be your legacy, that my kids aren't going to be able to fish for snapper. They're definitely not going to be able to collect abalone, probably not rock lobster. When you consider all the challenges that the marine ecosystem's under, and it's not just marine, you look at some of the big operations in the Murray-Darling Basin on yellow belly, illegal fishing and stuff. This is the serious stuff. So the minister needs to come out and put his hand on his heart, make a public statement. No, this is actually going to be beneficial for fisheries management, this reform. And if it's not, then do what VRFish are advising, what the union are advising, what the commercial sector are advising, what the marine environment sector, conservation sector are advising, and that's halt the process. Because only the minister can do that. The minister can halt this process, this reform process, go back and find a better way. And that's it. Because when you put this picture together, budgetary driven, large cuts to enforcement and compliance, presence, big area, regional gaps in current staffing, gee whiz, obligations under an act of parliament that you're administering, Minister. This is,
It doesn't stack up, Ben, and I think that you've got a map that sort of shows the regions that fisheries officers cover, or the size of the Port
station
Phillip Bay.
boundaries.
Yeah, station boundaries. If we could perhaps show that one, I think that's important, because that also, if you effectively overlay it to where the non-compliance was, you're absolutely
that's
right.
what I mean. So you look at this map and it shows the station boundaries. So inside that red boundary is the Port Phillip region. And ultimately you've got on the left there's Queenscliff, then you've got Altona up north, Brayside, Mornington and Cowes. These are the 5 stations slated, to be turned into 3 somewhere. The proposal's St Leonard's, which is near Queenscliff. Can't remember where the others are. Tooradin.
Yeah.
And where was the other one in the north of Port Phillip Bay?
No, it was Karen.
Noting the regional gaps in staffing of fisheries officers, noting the number of wreck fishers, the incentivised, Shamateur and syndicate fishing under this proposal, and that's a given. You don't even need evidence. There's enough research in the FRDC files to show the outcome's going to, this reduction in deterrence from on ground, the risk of getting caught for the criminal element, not just the wreck fisher generalist population that'll now, think, oh, well, I've got less chance of getting, collared for this. I'm going to take a couple of extra gars. That's going to have an impact eventually, but not as much as 5 carloads of, Point Cookians heading down and stripping one of the SMUs clean before the ab divers get there. And then selling it out the boot of the car, and that's insane. And how is this, just how is it possible? That's the ultimate question.
Yeah, I think that this plan is completely thawed, and I go back to that it's on the head of VFA to listen to their constituents, but to listen to the people that are actually the fishers. The Labor government, love them or hate them, advocated for ultimately boat ramps to become free. It advocated for better use of fishing funds, fishing licence funds. It advocated for target 1 million, whatever that was ultimately became, but there is over 1 million fishers in Victoria. It advocated for its constituents to be recreational and pro-fishers and to support the Labor Party. And here is a classic example. We know that we've got to have budget cuts. You're not going to be able to move forward without reducing our debt. And certainly maybe the suburban rail loop's got to go so we maintain our credit rating. That's a whole different debate. But at the end of the day, you've got to lead, you've got to listen, and you've got to use an evidence-free process that is very clear in its understanding of what it will deliver and how it will continue to protect. And that is not what has been put forward. And no matter how you sell it, you can see through it. It's paper thin, it's wetter than a wet bar coaster, and it's not going to deliver. And I think that the evidence of how sort of overworked and not undervalued, but overworked and resource constrained the fisheries officers are, to think that you're going to achieve the same compliance with a crack team is absolutely fictitious. So, John, you know a lot about compliance. What is the resource, the requirement in actually making arrests and then delivering an outcome that is meaningful?
So, I hope I answer your question, Justin. But there's a point I want to shoehorn in here. Law enforcement has some staple principles. 4 of them. The first one is random and directed patrol activity, which is the primary basis of the deterrent factor for all levels of offending. The second point is a rapid response to calls for service. In this context, that's really your 1-3 fish call centres and then response by the fishery officers. Number 3 is retrospective investigation of crimes. Not sure how much that fits into fisheries enforcement, but the 4th one most certainly does, and that was Murray's wheelhouse, and that's the covert proactive investigations that is intelligence-driven. That's targeted at your people that you know they're serious and organised and very hard to catch. They might get caught randomly, but you're talking about people that go to significant lengths to hide their activities. Of all those methods, those 4 methods of random and directed patrols, they primarily are the primary providers of the general deterrent to crime occurring, and they can be really effective at detection if it's a little bit targeted or a little bit lucky, or you've got the experience of good FOs on your teams, of course, and of course we do now. But they're also the most reliable source of quality intelligence. It won't be your 1-3 fish calls. The quality intel that will come from your fisheries officers on the ground can't be beat. The probably next best source of good intel is your jilted spouses, etc. They're fantastic for giving up. I just wanted to shoehorn that in because we're effectively binning the primary and most important aspect of the staple principles of law enforcement.
Yep.
Concerns me greatly. So just to come back for a moment to Ben's heat map of offending around Port Phillip Bay, I want to talk really quickly about how VicPol allocates where police stations are within a LGA, but more specifically, what resources get poured into one police station. Why does this police station have this many people and this one have this many? And we get examples close to the city where you have, say, St Kilda, Paran, City West, Melbourne East, that are all, Melbourne West, that are all quite close to each other. They have huge amounts of police resources compared when we get out in the suburbs, and the further you get away, stations get smaller and they get further apart. VicPol uses it used to be called the police allocation model. It's now called the staff allocation model. I was involved in it in those 2 years in HR. It uses a bunch of metrics to determine what resources should be allocated to that work area. And it uses, I think there are 13 metrics, and they are actually kept quite secret. They use things like the population density, the number of licensed premises, brothels, entertainment precincts, square kilometres, and the existing crime rate, etc., to determine what the staffing model should be. I question when you look at Ben's heat map of offending and where we're talking about these fisheries stations or engagement hubs being, where's the science in that? Because I can't imagine any when you look at that heat map and you look at where these 3 hubs are going to be. It utterly confuses me, and I think it is random.
Yeah, I think it's ill thought out, John, is probably the truth, and I say that as an observation, not as a fact. But I think that when you come up with a plan that perhaps sells better than it's evidenced, that's why you're starting to get the people asking the questions that they're asking, because it just doesn't make sense. And it doesn't, like, whilst yourself, Murray, and Ben, in your own individual rights, has far more fishing knowledge than I could ever hope to achieve. But I think that in us talking and asking these questions, it very clearly demonstrates that something's not right here, and the plan doesn't fit the outcome that we actually really need here. And we acknowledge there needs to be budget cuts. We acknowledge that fisheries is going to feel some pain. We acknowledge that fisheries has to look different into the future than what it has in the past because of those budget constraints. No department is immune. I imagine they want to probably protect health and education more than anything, because that's a vote swinger, And
VicPol's copping $2 billion.
Well, that's right. You and I were talking about that the other night. $2 billion staffing freeze. Like, they're under recruiting at the moment as it is. So, I hope that people can still, or we know that crime's out of control here, and there's no reason why it won't shift over to fishing. It's a direct correlation. It will happen. They can't dismiss that it won't. Crime's up, and that will be right across the board from domestic violence to fishing non-compliance. Go, Ben.
Justin, I was just going to roll in and say, look, current advice is that actioning from 1-3 fish is at about 10% of calls results in follow-up. And I was going to ask Murray, in terms of investigative, and the proposal goes from 6 current to 4 investigators under the newly named Special Investigations Group, 1 being a regional manager. What part does on-ground patrolling of fisheries officers in their areas, Murray, make up, that next level of work that you would have done as an investigator?
Oh, as John pointed out earlier, and I just reinforce it, the quality of the information you get from the trained fisheries officer far surpasses the 1-3 fish call. Often they get the colour of the car wrong, the rego number mixed up, the numbers of people, the description. Look, and they're doing it often in a situation of fear. They're close to where the action is, so they get a little bit muddled with the clearness of the information. But a fisheries officer quite often will, through the course of an apprehension or an interaction, will go, you can smell it. Okay, that's not right. Yeah. And so they'll submit an information report that gets consolidated over time, and you get the similar activities across different regions, and then the analysts start to pick it apart or consolidate together, and it forms a picture, and then you go, bang, we're onto someone. Look, I wanted to ask you, Ben, a question, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure.
And it relates to Victoria's role in sustainably managing migratory species, straddling stocks.
Sure.
We've got Scullin gummy sharks that come into Western Port Phillip Bay to have their pups.
Sure.
We've got snapper, and I just saw some recent information about kingfish that were tagged by Deakin Uni. They've ended up in New South Wales. So we've got AFMA, South Australia, New South Wales, Tasmania as our near neighbours. Surely they must be having some concerns if they've been made aware of this, that Victoria may no longer be able to play their part in sustainable fisheries management of migratory species. Southern bluefin tuna.
There's definitely, so you've got state-managed fisheries, you've got the state managing Commonwealth fisheries under agreement, and then you've got the state managing internationally managed fisheries like southern bluefin tuna. And ultimately then, that's a really good point. So we're going to see, the idea that, intertidal mollusks are going to get absolutely belted under a diminishing deterrent of risk of patrols finding you especially in the central region. But ultimately, wreck fishers are going to, I can just see it. It won't be fisheries stock collapse are the first big hits we take, like snapper in South Australia or sandflathead in Tasmania. It'll be the Commonwealth telling us you can no longer catch southern bluefin tuna because all forms of mortality for southern bluefin tuna in, Victoria is too high. It's out of control. Yep. And this is something, that we have defended, and to his credit, Travis has as well, for a decade now, where the Commonwealth are trying to intervene in the recreational fishery for southern bluefin tuna. And when you see 5 big barrels dumped in the Barwon River, that's take for sale not coming off. That's not a wreck fisher letting it go bad in the boat over a long weekend. There's definitely, and we'll just get the plug pulled on fishery. That'll be it. Job done. And then, another good example will be there's some really important shifts happening in the marine environment. We're seeing it in the eastern zone rock lobster. And Murray, your question is probably as relevant for wreck fishing as it is for industry. I read from the ESM guidelines from the national level about what sort of compliance regime you should have in place to get your export accreditation. But should this proposal undercook the level of compliance and have the outcomes that the risk, is suggesting, then, there's a lot of damage going to be done to our really important commercial industry. The most valuable, rock lobster and abalone. Yes. They're not going to meet the guidelines. Therefore, they're not going to get export accreditation under the EPBC Act. And we're going to see other jurisdictions, I hate to think what they think about this. They'd just be scratching their heads. $9.4 million. You referenced the $2 billion from VicPol. $9.4 million in terms of state budget appropriation is a don't hurry this proposal. Halt it, work with the staff and the union, find the savings. Rec fishers, we just surveyed 2,000 plus rec fishers that said we prefer these priorities, enforcement and compliance being the top, as it always has been. Even the 2018 VFA study, 20% of those surveyed said they want more enforcement. This isn't a surprise, so ultimately 9.4 million is not a big rush. You're not going to save the state budget with that. So It can be found other places. There's other buckets of money. We're looking to the minister to lead and step up and, push back on Treasury, because that's the only way. Otherwise, we're going to have to kick in, and willingness to pay was part of our survey. Are you prepared to pay more out of the RFL? So we already invest significantly. It's not like we don't have skin in the game. So the idea that, this is an EBA issue, and by the way, those staffing and workplace issues, the EBA for fisheries officers also has enforced breaks of 10 hours after every 16-hour shift. So three, there's a response to just over 10% of 1-3 fish calls. You respond, there's 2 of you go out, both of you are on enforced break for 10 hours. It's just not, I can't, get my head around it. So ultimately then that's an even broader risk of impact, Murray, with other fisheries. It's really concerning.
I want to raise just a few points here, gents, just to circle around this conversation. Murray, I take your point absolutely on migratory fish, and one of the big ones that we know that we have an eastern and western stock is kingfish. And kingfish, we have a major issue, and certainly New South Wales has been noticing this in the recapture rate. So the stock depletion is pretty significant, and that could become a lot more vulnerable where it's travelling into other jurisdictions as well. The recapture rate is very, very high. Project Kingfish will obviously come out with their own information around that, but that could be some level of vulnerability there. I think one of the things that I'm going to be posted about online in this thread in a moment for raising this, because I don't want to give people ideas, but if you can't get active enforcement and you can't get good compliance and damage is being done, and generally you find out when it's late, you've got to go for the masses in correcting it, which means that decision process is tough. It can be swift, depending on how loud the noise is around it or the trouble around it. So once you lose it, like all of these people that advocate for smaller bags and size limits with no science behind it, you need to be very, very careful, because once you lose it, it's gone. And how do you then advocate for easier compliance for the smaller number of fisheries officers? You marine park your shoreline, because then it's easier to police those areas. And guess what? You can't fish in them. And tell me how many marine parks have become unwound from being marine parks? Not one. So your access becomes more difficult. And your access is going to be also made more difficult because you've got federal government pushing to change our energy production basis to renewables, which offshore wind farms are still a very relevant topic and still ongoing for down in Portland area and Port Fairy area, and certainly Gippsland. That will happen. And whilst they're building it, you can't access it. We don't know the impact for seismic testing and installation to fish species. We certainly know that there is major environmental issues around bird life, which is why it was removed out of the Wilson's Promontory region. That was basically dismissed and then moved up to Lakes Entrance region. And all of these things are ongoing because people make money out of it. Banks make money out of it. The Rothschilds, there's no conspiracy. So once you lose it, it is gone and you don't get it back no matter how much you kick and scream. Don't give them reasons to take it away. So, John, is what I'm saying there, do I just sound like a pissed off wreck fisher? Is there truth in that?
No, I reckon you nailed it, mate. I think you got to be very, very careful what you advocate for. Whilst you're dropping general bombs, I've got a couple.
Bring it on, John. Let's do it.
So the VFA has been banging the drum about 90% compliance. That means 10% non-compliance. Out of 1 million wreck fishers, I was never great at maths, but I think that's 100,000 people aren't doing the right thing currently or a very full MCG on grand final day.
Yes.
Doesn't sound so good now, does it?
Nope.
And that's when things are, by the VFA's own words, good. I find that very problematic. The other one that I don't think anyone's brought this one up in discussions over the last month. But so under the model, we get these community engagement hubs around the bay. I guarantee you, hand on heart, they will be staffed. Whether it's 5 days a week or 7 days a week, there'll be a business hours presence at those hubs come rain, hail or shine. I'm presuming then that comes out of your patrolling effort, that comes out of your 1-3 fish response. You have got nothing. You've got probably worse than what you think when you have these engagement hubs, because you've now tied up, I don't know, is it going to be a single person manning them, or is it, OH&S has to be 2? Who knows? But it's actually worse than we think. It's horrible.
What's the fix, John?
The simple call to action is put this thing on hold and let's the right people come to the table and find a better solution. Obviously, it starts with the VFA, doing their pushback, but clearly they're going to have to make some savings, whether it's the full 10 million or a portion of that. And it's clear, we haven't spoken about this at all, but I don't think it's very hard when you start to look at the annual statements of the VFA that are available online. There's significant waste. And that spending was done in times of good. We've enjoyed a very good time, haven't we, in wreck fishing for 5-10 years.
I think our contribution can increase. Yep.
Yeah, we wanted it. We got it in the last decade. I reckon 5 to 10 years. Yep. That's over. So some of those things that we've almost taken for granted now, like 10 million fish. Don't know where we got the number 10 million from, but we have. So be it. All the events we have, all the club grants, all the projects.
We've got to help the decision makers, and that's what Saturday's about, yeah?
Yeah, it's a show of strength. It's a show that we're serious and we aren't happy. There's a rally on.
Yep. So I think that's why don't we just cut to that for a moment. I want to come back to Murray to talk about a couple of things, but John, you've been a big advocate and very noisy online for those that follow you about an event this Saturday. Can we just talk about that and how people find out more about it, but also signing petitions and bits and pieces and those links and where people can find them? Because I imagine there's a lot of people online with our show tonight wondering what they can do and how can their voice be heard.
Yeah, well, the petition's moved to a parliamentary petition now.
Yep.
The Abalone Council of Victoria have put up a parliamentary petition, and ultimately then that's to bring on debate. That needs 2,000 signatures. So the 20,000 signaturechange.org, rip a voice from wreck fishers. That was heard loud and clear. The parliamentary petition needs 2,000 signatures to be debated in Parliament. That's got 1,600. go on. I mean, you might post it in.
Yep, we'll post up some links later on. Yes.
The rally on Saturday, this Saturday, you might post that up, and that's going to be an important show of voice as well. Tow your boats in, let's go. There's no win or lose on a rally. You know, if everyone goes fishing because the kingies are on out the front here, that's so be it. But and the weather is going to be good. So there's always that risk with wreck fishing. That's a really important one as well. But ultimately, don't go back to sleep, wreck fishers. You know, this is your kids fishing. That's how serious this is in the future.
At the virtue of Facebook algorithms, it can be hard to get that message out, and we don't know who will see what. So I think that I implore anyone that's sharing this or showing this, please make sure you've signed those petitions. Anyone that can attend the rally on Saturday. So what are the details to the rally, Ben?
Oh gosh, you've tested me now.
Caught you off there. That's all right. Murray, you know more about the rally on Saturday?
Yes, I do. I don't have the specific details, but the Facebook page has been sponsored by David Burgess, who's a former fisheries officer. Officer, and I think it's called Save Our Tourism or Protect Our Tourism.
Yep.
And then
links are going in the comments there, Murray.
Oh, right, good, yeah.
Yep, people are actually already putting it up. Thanks, Nicole.
Excellent.
Putting it up. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Can we just make sure that all of our watchers are just continually posting those links for the petition and the rally? And I know that if anyone follows John Cahill, he actually had the event up, and Peter Ferguson, you're pretty noisy, mate. You're a great guy, an advocate for fishing.
Great job.
Yep, Fergie, tell us all about it in the comments as well. Thanks for joining tonight. So that's how they can be heard. Ben, obviously it's important that we get as many members onto VRFish, and particularly paid ones, because one, you're an advocate for recreational fishing, and I think it's important that anything that you do or that you want to try and do from a legal perspective, an advice perspective, where you need to pay for engagement, you must pay for that out of your own sourced funds. You must. So membership, which is only I think $20 or $25, it's less than a bag of pippies down at good old Fishing Online down at Hastings. Join up and become a VRFish member. So, okay, you're agreeing with that?
Well, of course, I'm going to agree with that. Look, I'll give a good example. Animal Care and Protection Bill. You know,
Yep.
there's a big gap in it. It's going to catch clubs and charter, and we had to again prove to the government that was going to be an impact, negative impact on wreck fishing, and especially a couple of really important parts of wreck fishing, and we had to go and prove it by getting a legal opinion that we're not allowed under a funding agreement with government that we get that notional allocation. It's $1.70 per licence is what it works out to be, to fund our operations. We're actually not allowed to use those funds for a legal opinion other than for the business, like the legal structure of VRFish. So member fees are the only way, or me begging and bribing, senior legal eagles. But which we were very lucky to be able to do, thanks to Albert Park Yachting and Angling Club. So, but it's essential.
It has to be said, Ben. It has to be said that fishers have got to get behind VRFish. They really do, and often you face criticism of, what do they do? It's justifying their own existence. You hear that all the time.
Sure.
But fishers don't see what happens behind the scene. Like, I know a little bit. My wife's on the board with you.
Sure.
And I thank VRFish for standing up to that bill, because that should not go through unopposed.
It won't go through.
Yeah.
As it was written. It's been amended. We got a written guarantee from state government that part would be amended to remove any possibility of capture. The exemption for wreck fishing was put into that section. Why they left it off, or that part of the act of the bill, I don't know why they left it off, but they did. But ultimately, look, I hear a lot of very strange things from wreck fishers in my job, and there's always an element of truth. And when you look at what VRFish is, it's 2.8 full-time employees and a lot of volunteer blood, sweat and treasure. And we don't promote ourselves as well as we could or should, but I'm happy as a leader within VRFish to say your job's to go fishing, wreck fishers. You'll hear from us when we need help, but just know we're doing the job. We're putting runs on the scoreboard. We're kicking a few goals each, season from outside 50 and some big goals, gee whiz. Some of the things VRFish does that we don't promote enough, sure. But ultimately, the more you look, the more you see. So there is a great, I call it the great responsibility. It's two things of wreck fishers now. One is not to destroy the joint, and the other is to have a say. Like, you now have to defend what you do. It's an unfortunate thing, but if I was to talk about putting information in front of decision makers, how many wreck fishers are there as a percentage of the populace? Well, that's 1 in 5 decision makers that go fishing. That's 4 out of 5 that don't know what you do or what you need or what you want. So that's what VRFish does.
Yep.
And then if a decision goes against us, that's the next level of advocacy where you advocate for a better outcome. And that just usually involves me getting shot at by someone high up, but I'm used to it. It doesn't matter, the missus or the minister shooting at me, it doesn't matter.
Well,
Below and go. But
well
yeah,
done.
it is
well
important.
done, Ben.
30 years of peak body. There's a reason we're here. And if we rolled the list out, which we will, we've got a state forum that's going to happen this year that'll we didn't celebrate the 25th year of operation, but we'll have a small celebration of the 30th. And the list of achievements from VRFish, the VFA, we're critical of them because they steal our thunder quite often and claim our victories. But we don't, so what? Success has many fathers. Good. They're victories. And our list, on the scoreboard is remarkable when I look at, what VRFish has delivered over the 30 years. And I'm proud to be part of VRFish. And I'm proud that, more and more wreck fishers know that we're here. That's enough.
Yeah, they must follow you, Ben, and
because then they'll see what we do. Yeah,
you see what you do, but more importantly, see the advocacy that's coming, because I think this
guys, if you get involved in this stuff, you become bitter and twisted like Murray and John and I.
Look, VRFish is going to have a big presence continuing, obviously, into offshore wind farms. That's a big one, and that's
a lot of work at the moment. Yeah,
it's a lot of work. I just want to chase back to Murray for a second. Murray, you spent 37 years in VFA. You know its inner workings better than anyone else on this panel. You know its budgets. You've probably been through a budgetary process just a time or two with them. $10 million of savings. Let's just round it up for a minute. Let's say that we give the minister a bit of a windfall. We give him 10 million or 11 million. Is that available to cut elsewhere? And it will have a direct impact, but is that available to cut elsewhere to not impact fisheries officers?
Yes, it is. And I was on the management team at Fisheries Victoria and its various forms and departments, and never once in budgetary cuts were fisheries officers targeted for redundancies. Never. They are regarded as our frontline staff, and they're always exempt from redundancies. Look, I can see, I don't have the piece of paper exactly in front of me, but yeah, the events, the fish production and stockings, look, there's plenty of fat there that can be cut back without affecting this very vital function. While I'm on the feet, there's just a couple of other things I wanted to mention as well.
Go for it.
And that is, and John can back me up on this, we have experienced in the past where local coastal communities particularly, and some inland ones, become the custodians or the stewards of the local fisheries resources. And when they see people coming in with netting into that intertidal zone, they take things into their own hands. They become vigilantes, slashing tyres, smashing windscreens, out of frustration because they're not getting responses to 1-3 fish calls and the like. So that's one thing that could possibly emerge, and that becomes a local policing problem. I think Ben may have touched on it earlier. If we do get into situations where people are taking fish for sale, we've got a potential public health issue. They're not going to be put in ice and well cared for and, filleted at the market and then into fish and chip shops. They'll be in the boots of cars, bouncing around in the back of utes, all that sort of thing. And that's a potential health risk. And the other thing connected with our near neighbours and the role that we must play in managing those straddling stocks, those migratory species, is if we do deplete particular species in this jurisdiction, we're going to displace fisheries crime to other jurisdictions or indeed just recreational effort. If our SBT fisheries closed down, as an example, then all the fishers that target that species, they're going to go into Tasmania or into South Australia. And as for a majority of those highly sought after species. So, I mean, we've really got to protect what we've got. And if we don't, these are some of the consequences. I think, that's about all I've got to say about that.
I think you're absolutely right. And like this one gets pulled out a lot, the economic benefit. Those against the Grand Prix will hate that statement because the Grand Prix provides multi-millions of dollars of economic benefit to the state of Victoria. Rec fishers do as well. No one would like to think about it, but I can tell you right now, to take my boat fishing, it's a $500 day. It's a tank of juice in the car. It's juice in a big heavy boat. It's registration, depreciation, bait, tackle, and I can tell you the game fishing community here, whilst is you could say it's 100, 200, 300 people, it injects a lot of money. There's a lot of good tradies out there that do a great job and they love spending their money. They don't do camping, they do fishing. And in a tough economic time where actually fishers and fishing stores are holding their own because fishing has actually grown in our state, that's the last thing that we want to turn around on a number of small businesses, because that is an economic impact. So we want to keep people fishing. We want to keep rec fishers advocating for fishing correctly and responsibly. So I just don't think that people understand the real risk that, that your fishing will be impacted negatively, even if you're not the person perpetrating, fishing incorrectly. And it can happen swiftly. And once it's gone, it's gone. It doesn't come back easily. And, SA goes, oh, well, yeah, they were in uproar of the 3-year ban, and then that 3-year, I'm pretty sure, became 5. And the economic impact that the demersal fishing bans have had in Perth on complete angler Netherlands, for example, and fishing tackle stores, a number have closed. And people just think, oh, yeah, it's a shame. These are people's super funds. These are people's lives. They're their families. And, we've got an opportunity here to go, no, this proposal has far more economic reach and far more negative impacts through poor consideration. Again, handing out rods and reels by some really great fishing advocates to little Johnny down at a barbecue festival is fantastic. Kill it. Kill it. We're growing in fisheries engagement. We're growing in rec fishers coming and buying tackle. They will teach their kids. And yes, when we get the budget back, we will do more engagement activities. Kill it. It's gone. Shut that, Shut those engagement centres.
Yeah, that's right.
Shut those engagement centres. Yeah, they've got to go,
That, the rod and reel giveaway alone, I believe it was $1.6 million.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was out of RFL funds.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, that's our licence fees. Yep.
Yep.
And I think it was 1.4.
Okay.
Well,
Look,
if it's $1.5 million out of licence fees, take the $1.5 million out of licence fees to offset
add it to the enforcement budget. Yep.
Redeploy it.
Rec fishers have just shown a willingness to pay that. Yep. They've even said they'll cop a licence increase if it's for this.
Yep. But this is the thing. We all love how budgets are cut and we all hear the spin. This is now what we call operational efficiency.
Yeah.
Now, operational efficiency needs to be to deliver, to protect our fishery, to make sure enforcement and compliance is on the increase. I want to see VFA go, we've done a great job and we've held 90% compliance, but it was 90% compliance of 100,000 checks of recreational fishers, not 14,000, which was last calendar year, I think it was. Mr. Cahill, I think you showed me. So that's what we want to see. That means that mate, stand up and say, hey, rec fishers, you got it wrong, VFA. Say VFA, show us. Get 150,000 checks. Go check all the commercial fishery, which is doing a wonderful job. Go do that. But you have to be able to build for that.
Yeah.
Sorry, little Johnny, no more free rod, no more free snag, And look, I don't want to bash VFA. I think that fishing is the most inclusive sport in the world. Anyone with a disability can go hang a line with some help. It does not require you to be of a male persuasion at all. There are so many women engaging at our local club more than ever before. The ability of a man to outfish a woman has got nothing to do with strength, anything. The fact that we're a biological male compared to a female, anything. Anyone can be a fisho. So, all of those activities that engage different sexes and different groups, they don't need, I know it sounds really tough. They don't need to do it. They don't need to do it as a priority. That's what I'm advocating for.
Yep.
Shoot me down in flames, but I'm sorry. Tough measures, tough budget, got to make cuts, protect the fishery at all costs. This is just rubbish, absolute garbage. And someone tell me that I'm wrong. Tell me that I'm wrong, guys. You're the panel.
Yeah.
Of all the areas of the budget where money could have been saved, this is the last.
Yep.
Because the other absolute key priority seems to be stocking. And I'm actually quite a big advocate of stocking, but I'm really starting for the first time to stop and say, all right, we're ramping up to 10 million a year. What is the science behind that? Every puddle in Victoria has fish in it now, which I'll add further dilutes the enforcement effort required. It used to probably be relatively easy, but, the fisheries officers in Port Phillip have now got to keep an eye on these suburban lakes, because I guarantee you there's 1-3 fish calls happening there. Where are they going to be? It's all been diluted. Got to look at the budget, got to look at other areas and listen to what Victorian rec fishers are saying is what is important to them. Mm. The VRFish survey talks volumes, and we aren't buying the spin that's coming out of the VFA on this.
And Murray and I were talking the other night, Murray, the importance of science. So we had a number of scientific officers that are now going to be reduced as well, is my understanding. So, we were talking before the show that rather than in-source, we're going to outsource. We're going to get consultants and, survey companies to help us out at some ungodly cost. Sorry, not good enough. And Murray, I think you were sort of commenting that at what stage does the science prove that we've stocked enough? Because an ecosystem then has its own ability to sustain itself.
Yeah, particularly with native species. There's got to be a point where it can sustain itself. If the ecosystem is supportive of that species, why do you just keep pouring more and more and more fish in? It's senseless. Yep,
I agree. Now, guys, we're back at the panel. We've been going for a long time.
Yeah.
Has anyone got anything that they would like to add that hasn't been discussed? Now's our opportunity. And if we're going to drop bombs from a B-52, let them rip.
Okay, I'll open the batting. And this is worst case scenario. People stop buying licences. They don't adhere to bag limits, size limits, gear restrictions, and we start seeing the use of nets. That can have a catastrophic environmental effect. We've got penguins, dolphins, seals, platypus, water-based birds. Look, it would be an absolute environmental disaster. And let's hope it never ever gets to this, but there are some of the risks.
Okay. John, Ben, anything else to add?
Oh, just one thing I'll throw in before Ben's probably the right one to close off too. I believe the boats are getting sold. Five of the fleet.
Mm.
I don't know how accurate that is. It would make sense if you're cutting fisheries officers to get rid of those rather expensive vessels. But where's your capacity to do the core role that we're assured will still occur?
Well,
I question it.
My understanding is that boats have been sold already, John, and there's more to come. So, At what stage is this a consultation versus?
It's not a consultation.
No,
this
is an action. This is an action.
Yeah. It's dressed up with words to be a consultation. It's no consultation.
It can't be a consultation.
Yeah.
Can I just add something there? Okay, they start selling off assets. I guess next is the depots that have been established at Cowes and Mornington and Brayside and Altona. There's no going back there, not to those sites. Once they're sold, you'll never, ever be able to buy real estate back in those locations and kit them up specific for fisheries compliance. Once it's gone, it's gone.
And that was one of our last points in our letter to the minister, that this is going to cost more to fix than you're saving.
Oh, yeah.
That's clear. But anyway, that's. I mean, VRFish are just going to keep chipping away like we do, you know. But we're going to rely on rec fishers' voice. I mean, you know, we're putting out advocacy updates, and that tells you generally, you know, VRFish are needing support, and rec fishers need to maintain their voice to avoid this outcome, to help. You know, we need all the help we can get.
Yep. So I think let's just cover that off in closing, because then I'm going to drop a bit of an editorial. First of all, to all the rec fishers that follow Just Your Average Fishers and all the associated commercial charter guys and fishing stores that follow our page, I implore you to keep sharing this live around. We will put it up on our YouTube so people can visit it later. Like and follow. There is nothing commercial about Just Your Average Fishers. Ben and I do not earn a cent from doing this. We do it because we advocate for Just Your Average Fishers becoming better fishers, and we're the worst of them, and we hope you enjoy our stories. But follow us, follow VRFish, follow VFA so you understand what some of the spin is. You can't even make comments now because they turned them off because they didn't like what people was telling them. And sure, a few were nasty, so I don't blame them, but you can delete those. You don't even allow the public that you serve to make commentary against your own posts. Shame. You know, turn up to the rally, sign the parliamentary petition. We've put links here. Sign up and be a member for $25 or whatever it is to VRFish. Do it. Have that voice. Contact your local member of parliament is very important as well, and speak to them about how you advocate for that this policy is a dud policy. And I remember, and I'll move into my editorial now, and I'm passionate about this, and I'll leave this as a parting remark. I remember this state, and I don't mean to call out a particular party, but I remember a government coming to power in this state saying that a contract was a dud contract for building East West Link, and then paid $1.2 or $1.3 billion in tender compensation, which wasn't compensation. It was just we needed to pay tender costs. And that kicked off what then became a very big debt issue for Victoria. Look, can't hold COVID against them. There was no playbook for that. And, you know, it is what it is. Right now, VFA needs to stand up and lead to protect its fishery. To sit there and say that enforcement of 14,000 checks is awesome compliance and we've got no issue here, and we're going to educate people through a centre that some tourist who's not going to even fish and invest in this community, fishing community, on a regular basis is where it's at, is a joke. If you can't find $10 million of saving in a multi-million-dollar budget each year from not handing out fishing rods, for not advocating for learning, engagement, and putting bands at a festival on in a particular community, then sorry, you have lost your way. Your primary purpose in the state of Victoria is to protect fisheries, to have science behind the protection measures that you bring in, to protect those bag limits and advocate for people to be able to access fishing, but doing it in an appropriate manner. That's what your responsibility is. And at the core of your responsibility, if you can't afford to do any other advocacy, that's what you must deliver. And quite frankly, the decisions that you have made, the decisions and the justification that you're putting out is, quite frankly, ludicrous. It's ill thought, And it's stupidity if you think that recreational and commercial fishers believe in it. The fact that we're standing up for your fisheries officers, of whom you've put gag orders on so that they can't say anything to protect their work entitlements, which is an absolute disgrace, and I'd question Fair Work Australia to whether you can legally do that, is just so poor. It is so poor. It's damning, it's poor thought out, and it's pathetic. So stand up and lead. Lead by protecting your fishery. Tell us that we're going to miss out on a load of other stuff. Tell us. Do it. Cut the 10 million elsewhere. Keep the fisheries officers. Return them to the numbers that they need to be so you don't look like a laughing stock against other states that have just as many fishers. And protect our fishery, because I want my kids to be able to fish. I teach my kids how to be average fishers, and they love it. I teach a lot of other people how to fish who have mental illness, and they love it. And that's the one thing that got me through these COVID lockdowns, was delivering shows like this and advocating for fishing. To see that destroyed, I won't cop that, and nor should you. And on that parting note, fix the problem, fix the budget, deliver it properly with evidence, and we'll support it. Just Our Average Fishers, guys. Thank you so much to our panel, Ben Scullin, Murray Donaldson, John Cahill. You guys are absolute legends in supporting me and all of those fellow fishers out there. We will continue to advocate on your behalf. And if we need to come back here somehow and continue to support you, we will. But for everyone else, thank you for support. Be loud, share it wide. Just Our Average Fishers, live, non-biased and free. Catch you next time.